Welcome, everybody. We are going to give another minute or two so folks can enter the room, and we'll get started. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I'm Demi Mkhilau, President of the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, otherwise known as WICHE, and we're excited to talk with you today about the release of Knocking at the College Door, our national projections of high school graduates. Before we get into the projections, just a few notes and guidelines. Everyone is muted on the webinar, but you can ask questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll have time at the end for bigger discussion and questions and answers, and we'll try to hold off all of the questions until the end. But if there are clarifying questions as we go through some of the data and charts, I'll interrupt our speakers to address the questions as we go along. And our intention is to present general information on the call, but if you'd like to dive into more details about a specific state, we can either stay on the line after the general discussion, or our team is available to talk with you more via email or even the telephone. So our plan for today is to spend about 30 to 40 minutes going through some of the high-level findings and key data points, and then we'll open up for discussion. And I also want to add one note about potential Zoom bombers, which of course is a fear for all of us in this day and age. We have taken precautions by requiring registration for the meeting, but if we have any issues, we will remove participants that seem to be causing the issues. And then if we are not able to fully handle the issues, which I sincerely hope that isn't the case, we'll simply stop the event and reconvene at a later time, and we'll contact everybody who's registered to share those plans. Again, we really hope that that doesn't happen, of course, and we don't expect any issues, but we do want to be prepared. And lastly, we are recording the webinar and we'll add it to the website at knocking.wiche.edu in the very near future. First, as background, I'd like to tell you a little bit about WICHE. WICHE is an interstate compact made up of 16 members covering the Western states and Pacific territories. And specifically, that is Guam and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. Broadly speaking, we have a mission to improve post-secondary access and success for all citizens of the West. And putting out usable research and data is one of the many ways we work toward that mission. And although we usually focus our work in the West, some of our efforts, like Knocking, are national in scope. And in addition to the policy and research work we're discussing here today, which is heavily involved in numerous other areas throughout higher education, including distance and technology mediated education, mental health, which was certainly an issue before the pandemic and has only grown in importance, and efforts working directly with institutions like our Interstate Passport, which is helping to improve the transfer process for students. Before we get into the discussion about Knocking and our projections, I'd like to quickly introduce the team behind the report and the data, and just acknowledge the great work that our colleagues have done. Piers Brandsberger is a senior research analyst at WICHE and is the lead author of the report. Colleen Falkenstern is a research analyst and is the data expert behind the visualizations that you'll see on the website. Patrick Lane is our Vice President of Policy Analysis and Research, and he oversees the production of this report, as well as many other policy and research activities at WICHE. Melissa Sanders is an administrative assistant at WICHE and has been responsible for organizing this event and making this discussion possible. So a big shout out to her. And I'd be remiss if I did not give a quick nod to the history of this report. This is the 10th edition of this report. We've been putting out these data on a regular basis, roughly every 4 years since 1979. And I was not involved in WICHE in 1979, as you might guess, but the report has become a key resource for education planners and policymakers, institutional leaders and enrollment staff, and many different organizations working throughout the educational landscape. And also, you may not be able to see it in the many thumbnails on these reports here on the slide, but if they were bigger, you'd see that the College Board has been a supporter of this work for decades, dating back to our 1984 edition, which I wasn't involved with either, but it's the second one in line there with that wonderful three-dimensional map, if you can see that. And we want to thank them for their long-standing and continued support of this important work. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Pat, in just a moment, but I wanted to highlight the electronic resources that are available. Some of you who are following the WICHE website may have noticed that we launched a new website earlier this summer, and you'll have an opportunity to see that as well. I'm quite excited about it. But we'll put the links in the chat box and you'll see that. And I won't go through each of these, but they should be pretty self-explanatory. And we've designed a site that should be fairly intuitive for you to navigate through and access all of the available information. So also through the website, you should be able to download charts, PDFs, and the source data behind the model to meet your own needs. If you do have questions or need something that doesn't seem to be readily available, please feel free to reach out to our team and we'll try to get you what you need. You don't need to, or you may want to just quickly see that we have a main landing page, a report, an executive summary, technical appendix, and dashboards, and that's listed here on the slides. And I'd point you to our interactive state regional charts and tables, and you'll notice there in the Tableau that you can download anything that you would need from those dashboards. So I will turn it over to Pat Lane, our VP of Policy Analysis and Research at this time, to quickly walk through some of the findings.
Thanks, Demi. And what I'm going to walk through now are really just some of the basics. We want to get to your questions as quickly as possible, so I'll just show some of the high-level findings and resources that are available. First, let me talk about what's not in the report and get that out of the way. Our model is built on data for enrollments from the federal government and numbers of graduates collected directly from the states. The latest year of actual data in our data set is for the 2018-19 school year, meaning that data on how COVID-19 has impacted progression, retention, and completion are not included. We will be updating our projections as new information becomes available. And while we certainly expect that the pandemic will have a significant impact on students and potentially an outsized impact on low-income students and students of color, it will take several years for those effects to show up in the data, but we hope to put out some resources that will give all of our data users more information about the potential impacts in the near future. We still feel that putting these projections out now is really important. As policymakers and educators are working to respond to the pandemic and the economic damage it's causing, they really need the most up-to-date information possible. So here are the top line findings. What you can see is that our education systems have been producing graduating classes that have grown steadily for more than 2 decades. In 2019, again, the most recent year of available data, the country produced just under 3.8 million graduates. WICHE projects modest growth through 2025 when we expect the country to peak at 3.93 million graduates before entering a period of decline to just over 3.5 million graduates in 2037. Although national improvements in high school graduation rates are helping to drive the short-term growth that we expect, the decline in birth rates that was accelerated in the Great Recession is a key driver of that peak and then decline. As birth rates fell sharply during the recession, there simply aren't enough high school students to continue the trend of growth. One caveat that hopefully is clear for those of you that use the data regularly, this won't be news, but throughout our discussion today, we're talking about the number of high school graduates, not graduation rates. Although rates certainly influence the number of graduates, they are not the only factor. So as we talk about growth and decline, I'm referring to the number of graduates, not the likelihood of graduation. And also, we don't plan on this call to go exhaustively into our methodology, but I will discuss it briefly here. We use what's called a cohort survival ratio methodology to produce the projections. What this means is that we look at how many students in the preceding year progressed to the next grade level, or graduation in the case of progressing from enrollment in 12th grade. Analyzing these survival rates allow us to project what would happen if recent trends, including factors like migration, mortality, immigration, and educational policies, all remain constant. That's a gross oversimplification of the method, but it should give you a rough idea. Of course, that doesn't ever happen. As policies change, schools improve in how they serve and reach students, and much, much more. But overall, this method is reasonably accurate, especially in the short term. Peace will talk later a little bit more about accuracy and some of the sources of change, and we can always talk more about the methodology during discussion or offline if you want to get really into the weeds. The national numbers mask some of the variation that we see at the regional and state levels. Here you see essentially the same chart broken out at the regional level. On top, you see the South producing 1.4 million graduates in 2019, and the region is expected to see growth through the mid-2020s before declining to be roughly at the same level they are today. The next level down represents the West, and again you see some slight growth through the middle of the decade before declining to about 830,000 graduates in 2037. For the Midwest and the Northeast, the next two bars on the chart respectively, you see that we project them to remain fairly flat through the mid-2020s before declining. This chart shows essentially the same data through a different view, and here you can see how the different regions contribute to the gain or loss of the national total of high school graduates compared to 2019. So in that first grouping for 2025, you see that the country as a whole expects to see just over 150,000 more graduates than in 2019. The bulk of this growth is in the dark gray bar representing the South and the blue bar representing the West, with those regions contributing 99,000 and 51,000 more graduates respectively. The story changes as we look in 2030 and see declines compared to 2019 driven by the Northeast in the yellow bar and the Midwest, the light gray bar, while the South and West are slightly above 2019's levels. In 2037, you see the relatively large total decline compared to 2019. The South doesn't show up in this bar as the region is roughly back to its 2019 level, but declines in the other three regions contribute to the overall declines of just under 250,000 graduates. And while the national numbers are interesting and typically the subject of a lot of news coverage around knocking, I expect that most folks on the call are interested in specific states, whether that's where you're located or regions where you draw significant numbers of students from. I'm not going to go through all the states or these next slides in tons of detail, but I wanted to quickly show you some of the state level information that you can get from the site. This information is easily accessible on the dashboard link that Melissa shared earlier, and these are just screenshots drawn from the website. So if you go to the site, you can play around and there's more information as you mouse over the lines, and you can, as Demi mentioned, download the data behind the chart. But this shows the same general line chart for California with data broken out by public and private graduates. And you can see that it follows a roughly similar pattern as the nation, a slight growth into the middle of the decade, followed by a somewhat steeper drop to 2037. Thinking back to the brief methodological discussion I shared earlier, what this typically means is that we're now seeing fewer students in elementary school that would then be progressing through to graduate in the late 2020s and 2030s. Here's another state chart just showing an example of some of the different information you can get about race ethnicity, and we'll talk more about race ethnicity in a little bit. But this is a chart for Florida, and you can see here that Florida projects to see strong growth among its Hispanic students, which are the set of green bars second from the left. That's compared to the blue bars, which are white students, and that represents a slight decline between now and 2036. The darker bars represent projected years, with the lighter bars representing actual data. And what you can see is sometime around the middle of the decade, the number of Hispanic graduates is expected to exceed the number of white non-Hispanic students. And I do want to make one note here that whenever we're talking about race ethnicity data, we are speaking only about public school graduates. The data that we have that's available for private schools does not include usable disaggregations by race ethnicity. So that's one important caveat. And again, the goal here is not to go through in detail lots of different states, but just to show some of the resources. And we've chosen a state here that exemplifies some of the national trends around diversification that we'll discuss in a minute. Here we see another view of what's driving changes in a state's number of graduates over time, this time for Illinois. What you see is a state where the number of public graduates is expected to decline by 33,000 by the class of 2036, driven primarily by a declining population of white non-Hispanic students in the blue bar. The state is also projected to see some declines in the number of Black and Hispanic graduates over time, while the number of multiracial and Asian, Native Hawaiian, or other Pacific Islander students increase. Again, there's plenty of other national, regional, and state level information that you can access through the website, and I've just shared an overview. So please feel free to navigate to the site and poke around after the webinar, of course. So for one of the key takeaways is that top line finding of modest growth followed by decline. Another key theme is that the population of high school graduates will continue to get more diverse in the coming years. As I mentioned, these represent public high school graduates only. And this chart does a nice job of summing up the story. What you see here is the blue bar representing white non-Hispanic students is steadily shrinking over time. White non-Hispanic students make up just over half of the graduating class in 2019, but are projected to decline as a proportion of the total to 43% in 2036. While the number of white graduates is projected to decline, you'll see projections of the proportion of Hispanic graduates, represented by the dark green bar, is expected to grow slightly from 25% of the total to 28% of the total over the course of the projections. You can also see that Asian Pacific Islander students are expected to increase slightly, as are multiracial graduates, which are actually expected to double as a proportion of the total graduating class over the course of the projections. I also do want to note that the American Indian Alaska Native category has some interesting findings related to it. Based strictly on the data using federal reporting guidelines for race ethnicity, we expect the number of graduates to decline both in total and as a proportion of the graduating class. It's worth noting, however, that a significant number of American Indian Alaska Native students also identify as another race, so many are categorized as multiracial students. And for those interested in such things, we expect that in 2021 or 2022, that would be the first year in which non-white students make up a majority of the public high school graduates. So we have a couple of different ways of looking at the race ethnicity data. This chart shows the change in number of graduates compared to 2019, sorted by race ethnicity. The blue line shows the significant decline compared to 2019 in the number of white non-Hispanic graduates. Meanwhile, the green line representing Hispanic graduates shows strong growth through 2026, then starts to level off and even decline somewhat. But at the end of the projections in 2036, there are still projected to be more Hispanic graduates than in 2019. Meanwhile, the total number of African American graduates is expected to decline slightly, while the number of Asian Pacific Islander students is expected to grow. This slide shows essentially the same chart, but for multiracial students, American Indian, Alaska Native students, Asian students, and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders. You can see here the strong growth I mentioned earlier among the graduates of two or more races, and substantial growth among the number of Asian graduates as we are able to disaggregate Asian and Native Hawaiian students just through 2030. You can also see that slight decline of American Indian Alaska Native students that I mentioned earlier. These next two charts show essentially the same data, but show the projected growth or decline by racial ethnic group as a percentage of their total numbers in addition to the total overall number of decline. Still, you see the significant declines in the white non-Hispanic population, dropping almost 20% or 300,000 graduates over the course of the projections. And the number of Hispanic graduates expected to grow substantially by 2025, then come back down slightly, ending up 9% higher than 2019. You can also see about an equivalent decline in the number of African American graduates through 2036, ending up down 8%, while the number of Asian Pacific Islander graduates is expected to grow by 24%. Looking at American Indian, Alaska Native, multiracial graduates, and disaggregated Asian and Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islanders, you can see the same trends from the earlier slide. American Indian Alaska Native students are projected to be down by about 27%, while those graduates identifying as multiracial are expected to grow by more than 80%. There's also substantial projected growth among Asian graduates, while the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander graduates remain relatively flat, projected only to 2030 for those last two groups due to data limitations. Okay, another key theme. Recent years have shown a shift with more students enrolling in private schools. Here's the top line finding for private schools, and you can see that although the private sector saw some slight declines coming out of the Great Recession, the last several years have produced strong growth in the number of graduates. The last year of reported data is for 2017 because we rely on federal survey for these data, and that was the last year for which data were released. But we project growth through the middle of the decade, growing from about 350,000 students to just under 400,000 students before declining to about 360,000 students in 2037. And here you can see how the changes in the number of private school graduates compared to public school graduates. The lighter gray bar represents private students. The black bar represents the overall total of high school graduates, and the blue bar represents public school graduates. So what you see here is that there is expected to be stronger growth as a percentage for private school graduates before declining to end up about 4% above where the number of private school graduates sits in 2017, while the number of public school graduates is expected to be down about 5% over the same course. But you can see here clearly from the data that the number of public school graduates is the big driver of the national numbers, as the national numbers end up just down 4%, slightly better than the public school graduates. So from here, I'll turn it over now to Peace Brandsberger to talk quickly about what has been leading to some of the changes in the projections. Peace?
Hi, thanks, Pat. And since it's been mentioned a couple of times that we're attributing the increases we've seen in the number of high school graduates from the ninth prior, or as predicted in the ninth edition, but compared to what has been more recently reported, I'd like to just point out a few data points so that users of these projections can understand how we've come to that conclusion. To begin with, I want to reassure you, we always look closely at what occurred with actual reported graduates since the edition we last released, and do comprehensive reviews of our methodology. The most recent comprehensive evaluation was in 2012, and a report of that is available on the WICHE website. Each edition, we also do a straightforward comparison of the number of graduates that have been reported by states and the federal government in their data sets for the 3 to 4 years that elapsed since the previous report to understand how well they compared. The projections have typically been within a couple of percentage points of the number eventually reported in the first several years. In statistical terms, our mean average percent error of the projections for total numbers of graduates over the 9 editions so far has been 1.4% error or difference from what was eventually reported by the first year, 1.7% difference by the second year, and 3.9% difference by the 5th year out. These types of statistics for public school projections are slightly less than those overall totals, and for private schools, as Pat just mentioned, with unpredictability, sometimes they can be have higher rates of difference from what is projected. Pat, next slide, please. So again, I want to reiterate, we don't produce the projections from graduation rate information. Rather, we use counts of graduates and students. So we dove in to really understand and be sure that what inherently makes sense about the rising graduation rates that have been observed over recent years and what we've now observed with increased numbers of graduates was evident and documented in more specific terms in the data. We've provided robust detail towards that in the report for states and various years. For now, I'll just summarize it at the national total. According to the US Department of Education, the US average on-time graduation rate for public high school students increased from 79% in school year 2010-11 to 85% in 2017-18, the latest information available for the on-time graduation rates. So to be clear, on-time graduates are not all possible graduates in any year. Instead, they're roughly the number of ninth graders who graduated roughly 4 years later with methodological adjustments that the states make. And what we observe from the data we collect, which are the total annual counts of graduates, not limited to on-time graduates, is that the total annual number of graduates has usually been 7 to 10% higher than the estimated number of on-time graduates. So as shown here, how they compare. The increase in the total number of graduates that we've observed over the time period of 2011 to 2018, 9%. The increase in the on-time graduation rate for the national level overall, all public high school students, was a 6% increase on the rates. And when we attempted and produced an estimate from the available data from the US Department of Education, the number of on-time graduates, the increase has been 11% over those years showing. So roughly comparable to what we're seeing with the rate of change and the number of graduates in total. Private high school graduates accounted for 30 to 58% of the unpredicted increase, or that the difference compared to what we produced in the 9th edition. And this can only be observed for fewer years, from class of 2014 to the class of 2017. It amounted to 35,000, between 35,000 and 81,000 more private high school graduates per year than we had previously predicted, as Pat spoke to, due to some of the volatility in that sector in those data. So what I'd like for people to keep in mind is the data points that I just cited describe what has brought us to this point in time. And what brings us to this point in time is what helps to predict the numbers of graduates that you see in our projections. It's somewhat less straightforward to compare the changes over all of these years by student type, but among public school students by race ethnicity, as Pat has demonstrated with strong Hispanic and other growth among students of color, Hispanic students or Hispanic graduates accounted for some of the largest difference between what was previously predicted and what has been recently reported. 75,000 more Hispanic graduates by the class of 2019 than we had predicted. There are also greater numbers of Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, and American Indian Alaska Native public high school graduates. There is more detail in the report about how these rates of increase in number correspond with the rates of increase in these students' graduation rates. On the other hand, white public high school graduates were overpredicted by our 9th edition, slightly by about 1%, or between 10 to 30,000 per year between 2013 and 2019. It's worth noting, of course, it's hard to tease out some of these differences from the data, but about the National Department of Education estimates that about 2/3 of private K-12 students are estimated to be white. Therefore, some of the increases in the private school sector may offset or be part of the story with the white public high school graduates. So in sum, graduates of color accounted for the majority of unpredicted increases. Less predictable private school sector also contributed a fair amount. And even though there were greater numbers of graduates reported in recent years than we previously predicted, there was still overall slowing of the rates of increase from the early 1990s to 2010, the number of US total high school graduates increased 2% per year on average. Meanwhile, the updated data indicate that the rate of average annual increase declined to 1.1% between the class of 2010 and 2019. Next slide. Finally, I'll mention just more in methodological or data terms, what to think about as you use the data for the first couple of projected years in these projections. This is more speaking to the math of it and less to some of the complicated real factors that might be affecting students as COVID continues to unfurl. The numbers for class of 2020 are the least likely to be different from those projected from a projection standpoint, because practically speaking, the COVID impacts would have been affecting 12th graders from March to May 2020. It's more likely, possibly, that graduation flexibilities provided a few more graduates than that COVID led to increased dropout for class of 2020 that our projections would not have already accounted for. On the other hand, it's more possible that COVID impacts may be perceptible in the eventual number of class of 2021 graduates compared to what we've been able to project. This is because 11th graders will have been experiencing the effects of COVID in their educational pursuits between March 2020 and May 2021. Beyond 2021, there is so much more that's unknown. And with that, I'll leave those possible impacts for our discussion. So Demi, I'd like to turn it back to you and see what we have in terms of questions from the audience.
Great, thank you, Peace, and thank you, Patrick. I actually have a couple follow-up questions to both of you, and then we'll open it up to the questions that have come through the Q&A box. And we've been trying to answer some of those as they go along, and hopefully those are useful to everybody in the audience. But I'll start off by asking the first question, and this one's to Pat. And I think this is probably a question really on everybody's mind. What does this all mean for higher education? You know, we've talked about the pending decline in the, that happens around the middle of the 2020s for multiple editions. And now it's almost here. So could you just talk a little bit more about the implications for higher education?
Sure. And yeah, I think if you go back through the work over the years, the peak in the mid 2020s has been a pretty regular feature for some time now. So hopefully for those out there working in post-secondary education, this is not news. And as we get closer and closer to that, it certainly would have been concerning for higher education to be facing that peak and then decline, even if we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, which of course we are, and everybody knows about the budget difficulties higher ed is facing. There was a report out the other day from the National Student Clearinghouse that showed significantly fewer number of students, particularly from low-income high schools, coming to post-secondary education. So it's almost like we're layering headwinds on top of one another, and it's definitely a big concern for higher ed. The institutions I think that will thrive and manage this risk are those that do a great job of serving non-traditional students, that do a good job of supporting students they already have through progression, retention, and completion. And frankly, institutions that do a good job of serving those students that higher ed has not served well in the past. The students of color that are making up a larger and larger proportion of our graduating classes. We shouldn't need another argument for higher ed to redouble its efforts on equity, but the stark demographic reality that we're facing should be yet another wake-up call that higher ed can and should do more to address equity concerns and ensure that students from groups that have not been well served are better served in the future.
Great, thank you, Patrick. And Peace, you're not off the hook of my questions. So, COVID was mentioned, and obviously that is dominating all of our lives in all sorts of ways. you mentioned that the data really won't be available for several years for the model to fully account for the impacts of the pandemic. But what sort of leading indicators will WICHE be watching for, and what steps will you take just to put out additional information to help us kind of get a glimpse into what we can expect?
Sure. So our model incorporates fall head counts, grade level head counts. So I think that's a first step, is seeing what happened with attendance, if you will, or just students showing up. That is actually at the base, the most that we incorporate in terms of attendance or student presence in schools, and then how they're progressing through schools. But as, for example, fall 2020 enrollments become available, we'll be able to see how that compares to 2019 in terms of progression year over year, and compare it to our typical ratios. Um, the graduates data are typically going to take longer to become available. I would expect that the class of 2020 states themselves, and as you mentioned, we've collected the data state by state this time, so we'll be keeping track by on a state level who's issuing information about their numbers of graduates. I would mention at that point, it's not at the level of detail that we're able to make any projections, but the National Student Clearinghouse released some data and report over the last week that did suggest that the class of 2020 was stable in number, which roughly conforms with what we would expect from our data and our projections. So we'll be keeping an eye on a number of different components that feed into a relatively simple methodology. And by simple, I don't mean simplistic. I mean a model that actually would be able to incorporate count information as immediately as available to really see how things might have adjusted in terms of numbers of students and numbers of graduates.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and turn to a couple of the questions that are coming in through the Q&A. And I will turn it to either one of you to go ahead and answer this one. Do you factor in any state-to-state migration shifts?
Sure, I'll
Yeah.
take a stab. The answer is yes. So if you had a very simple two-state system, a two-state country with 50 students spread out over K-12 in each of those two states, and in state B, all of the students up and left and moved to state A, we would see that growth in the enrollment in state A, and that would then be perpetuated through the model, and we predict larger numbers for state A. So in the real world, there is some migration. It's constantly shifting, and it shows up in those enrollment numbers. So to the extent it has affected enrollment numbers over the past 5 years, we do incorporate it into the model. For enrollment shifts that are quite rapid, as happened in Hurricane Katrina, for example, that does not show up as easily in the model because it's so sudden and it takes time for that to show up. But to the extent state-to-state migration rates stay relatively similar year over year, those are incorporated into the data. And again, on methodology, we're happy to talk through that in more detail.
Great, thank you. And we have a couple questions that I think I'm going to try to combine them a little bit. We have one, and this I'm going to direct to Peace, I think. How would you compare your projection model with the one used in Dr. Grau's demographics and the demand for higher education? And I'm going to combine that if you'll humor me, with the other question around aspirations. And I think the question reads, let me use my old eyes here. Some of the demographic information related to high school graduates has been assessed from the perspective of college going or college aspiring teens and young adults. And is this a perspective to consider?
Sure. Those are great questions. So Dr. Nathan Grau, in the time between our 9th and 10th edition, also came out with a set of projections that he calls the Higher Education Demand Index. And roughly speaking, the greatest difference between the projections he makes and ours is that his intention was to indicate what number and trends of 18-year-olds would be destined or creating demand by college sector. the methodology that he used. So it was focusing, roughly speaking, on high school graduates, not exactly the same, and specifically intending to parse them by the sector that data indicate they might be likely to attend. The methodology itself is quite different. He used a statistical model to produce those and ACS census data as opposed to K-12 education data. And there's benefits and disadvantages to both of the approaches. He found he was limited in the way that he could use the data available to produce estimates for every single state separately and for all student types. But they're really good complementary sorts of information. And it does relate to the question about student aspiration. Of course, ours are counts of high school graduates. Entirely useful for college sectors, very useful as well for workforce planners and analysts and the wide range of folks who are interested in the young workforce and college-bound population. Whereas Dr. Graz is going to incorporate through some of the National Education Survey data that he accesses, some of the information about by different types of student who would be more likely to be bound to a four-year sector, an elite college, or more elite college, two-year sector.
And I would just add, Nathan Grau was quoted in one of the articles, I think the Inside Higher Ed piece on the projections, and he echoed largely what P said, that they're very complementary and consistent with what he sees. He does approach it from a different angle, and we enjoy working with him, and I would give him a plug that he does have a new research coming out, I think a new book coming out in the not too distant future, so that'll be another thing for everyone to keep their eyes peeled for.
Great, thank you. So we're going to go to my friend Wea and Pat's friend. So he wants you all, I'm not going to even say us because he's asking you the question. He said, you mentioned the known and unknown impact of COVID-19. Some are saying that we may lose a generation of students due to the pandemic. I wonder if you could make a bold perception or expectation.
No. Sorry, Wea. No, that's a good question, and I think it's
or maybe
the right,
rough estimate. He clarified and said maybe rough estimate.
It's the right question to be asking. I think the idea that we could lose a generation is not out of the realm of possibility, and our role in higher ed over the next, weeks, months, and years is really to prevent that from happening. What's frustrating is the sort of lag in getting information. And I think one thing we could see, there has been some preliminary research that has shown in some states that they are expecting more graduates in the class of 2020 than previous, likely due to some of the flexibility in the switch to pass-fail. And even though we have pretty good reports that a lot of students simply disconnected from school as March turned into April, maybe some of those students still were carried through to graduation. So if we do see that data come out and be more substantial, I think we cannot let our guard down and stop focus. The reports like the one that came out from the National Student Clearinghouse are really sobering and should be sobering for everybody. But as Demi has been saying throughout this, we shouldn't view this as a fixed sentence. It's really an opportunity for education from preschool, all the way through higher ed to really respond and really redouble our efforts to reach those students that we expect are being impacted. So I think if you forced me to answer, I would say maybe if we all really focus and improve the way we're serving students, we can hold the declines to a minimum, but there's a very real possibility that we'll lose a significant number of students.
Great, thank you. And we have a question that says, what policies or practice has WICHE moved to change given the demographic shift? So no net new space, tenure track versus non-tenure track ratios, et cetera.
Can you say that again? Sorry.
sorry, it says, what policies or practices has WICHE moved to change given the demographic shifts? And then there were some examples. So no net new space, tenure track versus non-tenure track ratios, et cetera.
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. So most of those types of things I would say are really handled at the institutional level or in some cases at the state level. And we generally avoid discussions of tenure and leave that up to the appropriate institution. I think there are a huge range of policies and practices that we should be looking at. If we are concerned about higher ed enrollments, yes, you can see the peak and the decline, but only 70% of students roughly are going directly to college from high school. So if post-secondary institutions are worried about the number of students, there are plenty of other students out there. It's a matter of reaching them and serving them. I think some of the policies that we can think about, in the bigger picture, if we're worried about how are we going to meet future workforce demands, there are a range of higher ed policies from developmental ed redesign that has shown a lot of promise, and a lot of states are implementing that. Dual credit is an area where I think there is significant opportunity. It has shown some strong outcomes for improving high school graduation rates. I think some of the impact on students' post-secondary trajectories depends on how well their credit is accepted in post-secondary education. Sometimes they complete dual credit courses and show up expecting to start their post-secondary career as a sophomore and are told that the credit doesn't transfer as they thought it would. So that's an area where there may be further room for improvement. If you think less about traditional age students and start thinking about adults, there are any number of ways that institutions and states and systems can better serve those adult students. And by adult, I really mean anyone who's sort of not in that traditional high school to college pipeline. For adults, there are policies around prior learning assessment, where adults come in with significant college level learning, but it's just not recognized by our standard post-secondary system. So they end up sitting in classes for material that they've already learned and mastered. We just the other day put out a report with our colleagues at the Council for Adult and Experiential Learning on the impact that prior learning assessment can have on student completion. And it's, to sum up a very big and complicated report, a very big deal. It matters quite a bit. And that's a policy area that's also ripe for development. So Demi, I think I can keep going for another 15 minutes, but I do want to take a breath and get a drink of water. So
well, and I'll
I don't know if there are other ones.
Yeah, I would just add, I think that captures it really well. And, I think I would just add maybe a comment in the context of COVID in particular, that, we have done a lot of work, and that doesn't mean we're doing it alone. We're doing it in partnership with many, many other organizations and institutions and states and systems around technology enhanced learning, digital learning, and through WCT and our Every Learner Everywhere network, really thinking about how digital learning can be a tool to help address some of the equity gaps that we're seeing, not only in this in these data, but that the pandemic has been revealing that have been there. We know they've been there, but that really it's shining a light on now. So I would just add that to Patrick's great comments. We have a couple other questions coming through.
And
could I add? Bob? Sure.
Could I just add one more thing, because I'd be remiss if I didn't mention it. But student mental health is especially important at the policy and practice level. It's an area that doesn't get a lot of attention, but we knew it was a big problem even before COVID hit everyone very hard. And COVID has only exacerbated the mental health challenges, not just for students, but also faculty and staff. And it's an important health consideration for students, and it's the right thing to provide students with the support they need. But if we want to get crass and just talk about numbers and enrollments and retention, it's also a very big retention and completion tool. Students are not finishing post-secondary degrees in some cases because there isn't adequate behavioral health care. So that's something also that I think WICHE is strongly working to support our states and others around the country in making improvements there.
Great, thank you. That was an excellent addition. We have another question that came in, and I think this one may be directed toward peace. The last Great Recession was 2008 to 2011. Did we see any shifts in interstate migration that we may want to look out for in the next few years?
That's a great question. And Pat may have more to add on that. I'm going to take it more from the perspective of the data that we use for these projections, which speaks to families and children moving between states, and not as broadly to overall state migration. What I would say is you are able to observe strong changes in some states that you would expect from the Great Recession, in and out of California, in and out of Arizona, some other examples that escape my attention right now, but you were able to actually observe some of that in a way that would likely only be accounted for, though we can't quite tease it out, but strong shifts in year-over-year types of numbers that would suggest that there had been movement of families and children. What I've seen since, because keeping an eye on it, but not necessarily having the data that we need to quantify it in our projections, is that there has been a reduction, relatively speaking, compared to history, if not the Great Recession, in between state migration in the last 10 years. And that's again, it has, for our methodology, it's very much related to families and children moving. Migration of younger folks, for example, were they to resettle, would actually affect, and they not have children to begin with, would actually affect our projections many years into the future and perhaps not be picked up. But as you look for information yourself, trying to understand for a given state or your own state, how folks' movement related to the economic situation might affect those numbers, keep in mind you'll be thinking of it from the perspective of families with children, at least in the immediate term. So Pat, do you want to speak a little bit more on that, since you certainly got a lot of information from your multi-state longitudinal data exchange on migration?
Yeah, and I don't know, as I talk through the methodology, we sort of let the model do the work in identifying changes in state populations that could be due to migration, mortality, changes in state policy and other things. And it's really difficult for us to tease out what those specific impacts due to the Great Recession might be, other than to say that the data themselves account for it. So I think that would be an interesting question for us to dive into later. In particular, as we see and hear, more at the anecdotal level of new migration trends that we may see due to the pandemic. Which includes in our region a lot of large rural Western states, and we have heard and seen some news articles in those states that more people are moving there, just to get away from the big city, and whether that's actually borne out in the data, or it's a momentary blip, or it's real estate agents pumping up their business, who knows. And I'm nothing against real estate agents, but that's where you see a lot of those articles coming from. So that's, I think, the closest event that we have in near history to point to look at, if we compare what may have happened in the Great Recession migration wise to what's going on now. But that's a lot of words to not really answer the question. So maybe we go on to the next.
Demi, if I can interject, I did see a question come through that had to do with projections, not at a state level, but below a state level, be they for MSAs or for rural or urban types of configurations. And I would leave it to either of you to maybe speculate about what we would intend to do. What I can say is that we found it extremely difficult to produce something below the state level, because we need some information about the numbers of graduates. Certainly, we could depart from our current model and consider other ways to produce some estimates of high school graduates from other data. But the current data, we are hard pressed sometimes to get the number of graduates at a state level, let alone below a state level. And that has typically been what stood in our way or made it more difficult for us to produce what I call sub-state projections. I don't know if you all want to speak to that, Demi or Pat, about what our approach might be were we to entertain it this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would only add there's lots of things that we can do. And a lot of what we'll do between now and the next big release of data sort of depends on demand from the field. So, you know, if there is a strong need for MSA projections, we will be providing updates on COVID, but a lot of that we will take, you know, our direction from the field, because we really want this information to be useful for all of you. So the more we hear from you about MSA projections or sub-state levels, you know, we can look at that. And as Peace noted, there are some challenges, but that may mean that the projections don't look the same and don't use the same model. But wherever we hear from you all that certain things are necessary and really relevant to serving students, that's sort of the directions that we would try to take. You know, one that we hear constantly is about projecting based on income or socioeconomic status. And that's a one that we did a long time ago, and it's very difficult to do, and the data aren't great. But I think that's another area we'd like to continue to explore. So some of these others will be continuing to put out information over the next several years. But it's really what's most useful to the field.
Great, thank you. And there are kind of two companion questions that I will pose. We have a few minutes left. This is, do you anticipate that the census data, which are not yet available, will likely have an impact on the projections? And then the follow-up is, and are there any concerns about data integrity given the many challenges posed in collecting census data this year?
All right, I'll take the second one first. How about that? And try to remember the first one. So I don't think we have any concerns about the data integrity given the challenges with the census. The data integrity relies on enrollment data reported by states directly to, or excuse me, graduate data reported by states directly to us, and federal data on K through 12 enrollments. Those data have been collected roughly the same way for some time. The data we got from the states is new this year. In previous years, we got graduate data directly from the federal government, but they got it from the states, but they haven't been reporting that. So I think in terms of, without going into the deep weeds of the methodology, there are some minor differences in how states may report the data. If you dive into the data notes in the technical appendix, we'd be happy to talk more. So there can be some specific things, but in terms of the integrity related to the census issues, I don't think we've had the same problems. The question about whether the census data would have an impact on the projections, again, because it's different sources of data, we don't really see that impacting them, but it could be, you know, going back to that question from just a few minutes ago about what other projections or information we could put out. The census is obviously a rich source of information, and that would be something that we could look to for some of these other sub-state projections or other information that we might put out, but that shouldn't affect what we've put out here.
Great, thank you. And we have about 3 more minutes. Are there any concluding remarks that the two of you would like to make to the group before we sign off and let everybody go for the rest of the afternoon? Or the morning, depending on where you are, if you're out in the Pacific.
I do think, let me just put up our contact information before I forget. Which you should see now, because we really would like to hear from you all, and we are happy to do more specific, Zoom calls or whatever that would be useful to walk through some of the data in a more specific way, either at the state or the regional level, or if you have specific meetings where it would be useful, we're always happy to do that. So please feel free to reach out if you have questions about the data or anything else. Really, our emails are up there now. So Peace, I don't know if you have any other words.
No, thank you all for being here, and we'd love to hear from you as you begin to consume these information.
Well, and I want to thank the Witchy team for all the work they're doing, for everybody for being here. The one last question that I do see coming through is when the full report is being released. That is currently on the website, correct? Available for consumption and ready to go.
Yep, knocking.witchy.edu. And there's a PDF report, an online report, data dashboards, and everything else.
And we will be sending a follow-up email about the release out here after this webinar, and then the recording of this webinar will also be available for participants and others who may be interested. So with that, I just want to thank everybody for their time, for joining us today, and for your support over the years with producing these projections. We hope you find them informative, and we hope that you stay safe and have a wonderful day. Thank you.